Dr. Kevin Walsh was studying deep-sea migration patterns when he noticed something that made his 30 years of oceanographic research seem meaningless. For the past 6 months, every species of deep ocean life had been fleeing from a specific region of the Pacific, abandoning feeding grounds and breeding areas they had used for thousands of years. When Walsh's research vessel finally reached the evacuation zone, they discovered why the creatures were running. Something enormous was stirring in the deepest part of the ocean, something that the marine life instinctively knew was dangerous beyond measure. The moment the alien ship breached the surface, Walsh understood that everything scientists believed about Earth's oceans was a lie. The vessel wasn't just emerging from the water, it was connected to a vast network of underwater structures that his sonar revealed stretching across the entire Pacific floor like the roots of some impossible tree. According to his readings, these structures had been actively processing seawater for millennia, gradually changing the ocean's chemistry in ways that human science was only now beginning to detect. His most terrifying realization came when he analyzed water samples from around the ship. The alien vessel hadn't been dormant at all, but had been slowly terraforming Earth's oceans for thousands of years, preparing the planet for something that was finally ready to begin. I should probably introduce myself before I go any further. My name is Jake Brennan, and I was Walsh's research assistant aboard the RV Cousteau's Dream when all this shit went down. 3 weeks ago, I was just another graduate student from UC San Diego, working on my marine biology thesis and thinking the biggest mystery in the ocean was whether we'd find a new species of deep-sea jellies. Now, I'm hiding in a bunker in Nevada, writing this account because someone needs to know what really happened out there. The official story you've probably seen on the news is sanitized garbage. They're calling it a geological anomaly that caused unusual seismic activity in the Pacific. They're saying the massive displacement of marine life was due to shifting thermal layers, and that the electromagnetic readings we recorded were from previously undetected underwater volcanic activity. Every word of that is a lie. What we found 400 miles southwest of Monterey Bay wasn't geological. It wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't dormant. The thing that rose from the Monterey Canyon that day had been waiting down there, patient and methodical, working on something that would make every horror movie you've ever seen look like a children's bedtime story. Walsh didn't make it out of the Pacific, neither did most of the crew. I'm probably the only one left who saw what really happened during those final hours, and I'm writing this because the tremors have started again. This time, they're coming from the Atlantic. The migration patterns are shifting again and the creatures are running from something that's about to surface off the coast of Massachusetts. I need to tell you what we learned before it's too late. Let me back up to 3 weeks ago when this nightmare began. The RV Cousteau's Dream was a 180-foot research vessel equipped with state-of-the-art sonar mapping systems, remotely operated vehicles, and enough computing power to process oceanographic data in real time. I'd been aboard for 2 months, collecting samples and tracking migration patterns for Dr. Walsh's ongoing study of deep-sea ecosystem changes. The ship had a crew of 12, including Walsh, myself, and Dr. Tommy Valdez from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Valdez was everything I wasn't: confident, experienced, and annoyingly good at reading people. He'd been working deep-sea research for 15 years and had this way of making everyone around him feel like an amateur. The guy was built like a linebacker and had these piercing blue eyes that seemed to catch every detail. There was something magnetic about him that made even the gruffest crew members hang on his every word. "Brennan, you seeing this shit on the hydrophone array?" Valdez called from the sonar station that morning. His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. I abandoned my microscope and crossed the cramped lab space to peer over his shoulder. The proximity made my pulse quicken. Valdez always smelled like salt spray and something else, something that reminded me of expensive cologne mixed with machine oil. "Focus, Jake." "What am I looking at?" I asked, trying to interpret the cascading data on his monitors. "Listen." He handed me a set of headphones connected to the deep water hydrophones we'd deployed the previous night. The ocean should have been alive with sound, whale songs, ship engines, the constant crackle of thermal vents. Instead, I heard something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm sea, but the oppressive silence of a library after closing time. "How deep are those hydrophones?" I asked. "Sitting at 3,000 meters, right on the continental shelf edge." Valdez's fingers drummed against the console. "Jake, in 15 years of deep ocean work, I've never recorded complete acoustic silence from a hydrophone array. Ever. Marine life doesn't just stop making noise." Dr. Walsh emerged from his cabin looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His usually perfect grey hair was dishevelled, and his hands shook as he poured himself a mug from the galley's perpetual pot of bitter brew. "The migration data came through from NOAA overnight," Walsh announced to the room. "Every major fish population within a 500-mile radius has abandoned their traditional feeding grounds. Tuna, sharks, even the deep-dwelling species we've been tracking, they're all moving northeast at unprecedented speeds." "Running from something," Valdez muttered. "Or towards something." Captain Bobby Hendricks, a weathered Maine native who'd been working Pacific waters for 25 years, stuck his head through the lab doorway. "Dr. Walsh, you might want to see this. We've got some unusual readings on the magnetometer." The bridge of the Cousteau's Dream offered a panoramic view of the Pacific, currently painted in shades of gunmetal grey under an overcast sky. Hendricks pointed to a series of instruments clustered around the ship's navigation station. "Started about an hour ago," he explained. "Magnetic compass is spinning like a damn carnival ride. GPS keeps losing satellite lock, and the radio's picking up interference on frequencies that should be dead quiet." I watched the compass needle rotate slowly, almost hypnotically. "Equipment malfunction?" "That's what I thought, but I ran diagnostics twice. Everything checks out perfect." Hendricks scratched his beard. 40 years I've been on the water, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like something down there is, I don't know, broadcasting." Valdez leaned against the chart table, his forearms flexing as he studied our position. "We're directly above the Monterey Canyon system, deepest part of the Pacific continental shelf." "Deepest charted part," Walsh corrected quietly. "Our sonar mapping suggests the canyon extends much further down than official charts indicate." That should have been our first warning to turn around. Instead, Walsh made the decision that would doom most of us. "We deploy the deep sea ROV. I want to see what's down there." The remotely operated vehicle Nereid was our eyes into the abyss, a $2 million piece of equipment capable of diving to depths that would crush a human body in milliseconds. As the crew prepared for the deployment, I noticed something odd about the ship's hull. A thin layer of some kind of residue had formed along the waterline, like algae, but with an iridescent quality that shifted colors in the afternoon light. "Hey Valdez," I called, pointing to the strange coating. "You ever seen anything like that before?" He followed my gaze, and his expression darkened. "No, but I've heard stories from old-timers about ships returning from deep water research with unusual growths on their hulls. Most dismissed it as maritime folklore." "What kind of stories?" Valdez glanced around to make sure Walsh wasn't listening, then lowered his voice. "Ships that ventured into certain parts of the deep Pacific. Crews reporting that the ocean felt aware, like something vast was watching them from below. The ROV deployment went smoothly, Nereid's lights piercing the darkness as it descended into the canyon. At 1,000 meters, we lost the first camera. At 2,000 meters, the sonar started reading impossible geometries, structures that couldn't be natural rock formations. At 3,000 meters, just as Nereid approached the canyon floor, every instrument on the ship went dead for exactly 37 seconds. When the systems came back online, the deep-sea camera was transmitting an image the seafloor wasn't rock or sediment. It was metal. Vast expanses of worked metal stretching beyond the ROV's light radius, covered in the same iridescent coating we'd found on our hull. "Pull the ROV back 50 meters, Walsh ordered, his voice tight with scientific excitement and barely concealed terror. "I want wide-angle documentation of this entire area." The next 3 hours changed everything we thought we knew about Earth's oceans. As Nereid maneuvered across the seafloor, its cameras revealed structures that defied every principle of marine geology. The metal formations stretched in geometric patterns that hurt to comprehend, not because they were alien, but because they were too familiar. Hexagonal grids, spiral pathways, and what looked disturbingly like maintenance access ports dotted the canyon floor in perfect symmetrical arrangements. "This isn't a shipwreck," Valdez muttered, leaning so close to the monitor that his breath fogged the screen. The warmth of his body next to mine sent an unwelcome thrill through my nervous system. "These structures are integrated into the seafloor geology. They've been here for centuries," Walsh finished, "maybe longer. The ship's chief engineer, Danny Kowalski— damn it, I promised myself not to use that name. Let me call him Danny Brooks instead. Brooks was a thin, nervous guy from Seattle who could fix anything mechanical but turned green at the sight of blood. He'd been monitoring the hull sensors when he stumbled into our impromptu war council. "Dr. Walsh, we've got a problem," Brooks announced, his voice cracking slightly. "The hull coating is spreading. Whatever that iridescent stuff is, it's not just clinging to the ship, it's growing." Valdez and I followed Brooks to the stern deck, where crew members had gathered around sections of the hull visible above the waterline. The coating had indeed spread, forming delicate, almost crystalline patterns that pulsed with subtle bioluminescence. Up close, it reminded me of neural networks or circuit boards rendered in living tissue. "How fast is it spreading?" I asked. "Fast enough that we noticed the change in 4 hours," Brooks replied. "At this rate, the entire hull will be covered by tomorrow morning." Captain Hendricks emerged from the wheelhouse, his weathered face grim. "It's not just the hull, folks. Whatever this stuff is, it's interfering with our navigation systems. GPS is completely unreliable and the magnetic compass is spinning like a roulette wheel." Walsh knelt beside one of the crystalline formations, pulling out a sample container. "We need specimens for analysis." "Doc, I wouldn't touch that stuff without protection," Valdez warned, but Walsh was already scraping a small portion of the growth into a sterile vial. The moment the sample separated from the hull coating, every electronic device on the ship emitted a brief, high-pitched whine. The sound lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough to make my teeth ache and my vision blur. More disturbing was the way the remaining coating seemed to recoil from the sampling site, like living skin pulling away from a wound. "Bridge to lab, come in immediately," Captain Hendricks's voice crackled over the intercom, with an urgency that made my stomach drop. We rushed back to the wheelhouse where Hendricks was staring at the sonar display with undisguised alarm. "Whatever's down there, it's moving." The sonar showed the metal structures we'd been documenting, but now they were shifting, rearranging themselves in slow, deliberate patterns. As we watched, hexagonal sections rotated and realigned, creating new pathways and connections across the canyon floor. "Automated systems," Walsh breathed. "Some kind of self-assembling architecture." "Or it's reacting to our presence," Valdez countered. His hand found my shoulder as he leaned over to get a better view of the display, and I had to suppress a shiver at the contact. The timing is too coincidental. We start taking samples and suddenly the whole installation comes alive. Installation. That was the word none of us had wanted to use, but Valdez was right. This wasn't some ancient shipwreck or natural formation. It was a facility, purpose-built, operational, and apparently responsive to outside interference. The ROV's cameras captured something that made the blood drain from my face. Sections of the seafloor were opening like massive irises, revealing chambers filled with a soft blue-green illumination. Through the widening apertures, we could see movement. Not the chaotic motion of disturbed sediment, but coordinated, purposeful activity. "Those look like airlocks," Brooks observed, his engineer's eye picking out details the rest of us had missed. "Pressurized chambers designed to keep seawater out." "Or to keep something else in," I muttered. Dr. Walsh was practically vibrating with scientific fervor despite the obvious danger. "Deploy the secondary probe. I want samples from inside those chambers." "Doc, that's probably not—" Valdez began. "We're scientists, Mr. Valdez. This is the discovery of the century, possibly the millennium. Whatever's down there has been hiding in our oceans for God knows how long, and we might be the first humans to document its existence. The deployment of our backup ROV, a smaller unit called Triton, would prove to be our first real mistake." The probe descended smoothly through one of the iris-like openings. its cameras revealing chambers filled with structures that looked disturbingly organic despite being constructed from the same metallic material as the seafloor installations. The walls pulsed with rhythmic patterns of bioluminescence, like the chambers were breathing. Branching corridors extended beyond the probe's light radius, disappearing into depths that our sonar couldn't accurately measure. Most disturbing were the objects suspended throughout the chambers, roughly cylindrical forms about the size and shape of human beings, floating in some kind of viscous fluid. Are those? I couldn't finish the question. Preservation chambers, Walsh whispered. My God, they're preservation chambers. Triton moved deeper into the facility, following corridors that branched and reconnected in patterns that defied three-dimensional logic. The suspended forms became more frequent, and as the probe's lights played across them, I caught glimpses of details that made my hands shake. Pale flesh, closed eyes, and the unmistakable shape of human limbs. How many people go missing in the Pacific every year? Valdez asked quietly. Before anyone could answer, Triton's transmission cut out. Not the gradual degradation of a failing signal, but an immediate, complete loss of contact. The probe's tracking beacon went silent at the same instant. Mechanical failure? Captain Hendricks asked hopefully. Brooks was already running diagnostics. Negative. All systems were functioning normally right up until the signal cut. It's like something down there just turned off the probe. That's when the hull coating began to pulse in synchronization with our heartbeats. The iridescent formations covering the ship's waterline started flashing in rhythmic patterns, matching the pulse rates of everyone on deck. As our fear spiked, the flashing accelerated. When Captain Hendricks tried to start the engines to get us away from the area, the coating flared so brightly that it was visible even in daylight. It's reading our biometrics, Valdez realized, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this stuff is, it's connected to the installation below and it's monitoring our vital signs. Dr. Walsh stood at the rail, staring down at the water with the expression of a man who'd spent his life asking questions, and finally found one with an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The migration patterns, the acoustic silence, the electromagnetic interference, it's all connected. Something down there has been preparing for this moment. Preparing for what? I asked. Walsh turned to face us, and I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than the mysterious facility or the hull coating or any of it. Certainty. For us to find it, he said. I don't think we discovered this installation by accident, gentlemen. I think it wanted to be discovered. That night, as the ship drifted above the active facility, Danny Brooks developed a fever that wouldn't break, and the hull coating spread to cover 60% of the ship's surface. The first sign that Danny Brooks was becoming something else came at 0300 hours, when the night watch found him standing at the ship's rail, completely motionless, staring down into the black Pacific waters. Danny? Chief Petty Officer Luis Morales approached cautiously. Morales was a compact guy from San Antonio, built like a wrestler, with the kind of steady nerves that came from 20 years in the Coast Guard. You all right, buddy? Brooks didn't respond, didn't even blink. His fever had spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit after midnight, but now he stood perfectly still in the cold ocean air, wearing only a thin t-shirt and shorts. Steam rose from his skin like he was a human radiator. That's when Morales noticed Brooks's eyes had changed color, from brown to the same blue-green bioluminescent glow we'd seen in the underwater facility's chambers. Dr. Walsh, Dr. Valdez, get up here now, Morales shouted into the ship's intercom, never taking his eyes off Brooks. I was already awake, unable to sleep with the constant low-frequency humming that had started emanating from the hull coating around midnight. The sound was just below the threshold of normal hearing, but it vibrated through the ship's steel frame and into my bones. Valdez stumbled out of his quarters at the same time I did, his hair disheveled and his shirt half-buttoned. Even in the emergency, I couldn't help but notice the way the fabric clung to his chest. What's the situation? Valdez asked as we reached the deck. Brooks has been standing there for 45 minutes, Morales explained. Won't respond to verbal commands, won't move, and his body temperature is off the charts. Dr. Walsh emerged from below decks, his scientific equipment bag slung over his shoulder. His fever broke around 0230, but his core temperature is still elevated. Pulse is steady at exactly 60 beats per minute, no variation. That's not humanly possible, I said. Normal heart rate variability means there should be small fluctuations with each breath, each movement. There's more, Walsh continued grimly. His brainwave patterns have changed. The EEG readings from the medical bay show perfectly synchronized neural activity across all frequency bands. It's like his entire nervous system has been harmonized. Valdez approached Brooks slowly, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. Danny, can you hear me? We need you to step away from the rail. For the first time in nearly an hour, Brooks moved. He turned his head toward Valdez with mechanical precision, the glowing eyes focusing with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the hull coating's humming. The integration process is proceeding as designed, Brooks said, but the words felt wrong coming from his mouth. Biological compatibility confirmed. Neural template transfer initiated. Jesus Christ, Morales whispered, crossing himself. Danny, that's not you talking, Valdez said, taking another careful step forward. Whatever's happening to you, we can help. We can find a way to reverse it. Brooks tilted his head with that same mechanical precision, and I realized his movements were mimicking the way the underwater facility's structures had repositioned themselves. Reversal is not possible once neural template integration begins. The host consciousness will be preserved within the collective matrix. Fear is unnecessary. That's when I made the mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The moment the camera activated, Brooks' head snapped toward me with inhuman speed. The bioluminescent patterns in his eyes flared brighter, and suddenly every piece of electronic equipment on the ship began transmitting the same signal. The exact GPS coordinates of our position, broadcast on every available frequency. "Shut it off!" Walsh shouted. "Shut off the recording!" But it was too late. The damage was done, and we all knew it. The signal had been sent, received, and acknowledged by something vast and patient that had been waiting in the deep Pacific trenches for exactly this moment. The hull coating erupted in cascading waves of bioluminescence that turned the entire ship into a beacon visible from space. Below us, the seafloor facility responded with its own light show, irises opening across miles of the canyon floor as chambers that had been dormant for centuries suddenly blazed with activity. Brooks walked to the ship's radio console and began broadcasting in a voice that was becoming less human with each word. Emergent sequence activated. Terraforming Phase 7 complete. Initiate surface deployment. Stop him! Valdez lunged forward, but Brooks moved with impossible speed, his hand connecting with Valdez's chest in what should have been a gentle push. Instead, Valdez flew backward 15 feet, slamming into a support stanchion with enough force to bend the steel. The sound of breaking ribs was audible across the deck. "Tommy!" I rushed to where he'd landed, finding him conscious but struggling to breathe. Blood flecked his lips, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Don't move!" Internal injuries, possibly punctured lung. Valdez grabbed my shirt with his good hand, pulling me close enough that I could feel his labored breath against my ear. "Jake, the water samples from yesterday. Did you run the chemical analysis?" "Not yet. Why?" "Run them now," he gasped. "Something Walsh isn't telling us. The way he's been acting, like he knew this would happen. Check the goddamn samples." Before I could respond, the ocean around our ship began to bubble and foam. The sonar displays in the wheelhouse went crazy as massive objects rose from the canyon depths, not just the facility we'd been documenting, but dozens of similar installations across hundreds of miles of seafloor. Captain Hendricks tried to start the engines, but the hull coating had spread to cover the propeller shafts and rudder assemblies. We weren't going anywhere. "Dr. Walsh," I called out, helping Valdez to his feet despite his injuries. "What did you know about this? What aren't you telling us?" Walsh was staring at the rising installations with an expression that mixed scientific awe with something that looked disturbingly like relief. The water chemistry changes we've been tracking for months. They weren't random. The ocean's pH levels, the dissolved mineral content, even the plankton populations. Everything has been shifting to support a different kind of life. You knew, Valdez accused, wincing as he spoke. You brought us here knowing what we'd find. I suspected, Walsh admitted. The migration patterns, the acoustic anomalies, the electromagnetic interference. It all pointed to systematic terraforming on a scale beyond human comprehension. But I needed confirmation. Confirmation for what? Walsh turned to face us, and I saw the same bioluminescent glow beginning to flicker in his eyes. For the inevitability of it all. Jake, they've been preparing Earth's oceans for colonization for thousands of years. Slow, methodical, undetectable until the process reached critical mass. The first massive structure breached the surface a mile off our starboard bow, water cascading from its hexagonal hull like a waterfall. It was beautiful and terrible, a cathedral of worked metal and organic curves that pulsed with the same blue-green light we'd seen in the preservation chambers. That's when I understood what those suspended human forms really were. Not prisoners or victims, but templates. Biological patterns preserved and studied, neural maps copied and integrated into a collective consciousness that spanned continents. Brooks, or the thing wearing Brooks's face, walked over to where we stood supporting the injured Valdez. Neural integration is complete for this host. Additional subjects are required for Phase 8 initialization. Jake, Valdez whispered urgently, his voice growing weaker. The emergency beacon. In my quarters. Activate it and get off this ship. I'm not leaving you. You have to. Someone needs to warn. Brooks placed his hand on Valdez's forehead, and the transformation began immediately. The bioluminescent patterns spread from the point of contact, racing along Valdez's nervous system like liquid fire. His eyes widened in terror for just a moment before the glow replaced his natural iris color. No, I shoved Brooks away, but the damage was done. Valdez's body went rigid, his breathing synchronized to the same impossible 60 beats per minute rhythm. And when he looked at me again, it wasn't him anymore. Integration successful, both Brooks and Valdez said in perfect unison. Additional subjects required. Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly, the bioluminescence in his eyes now bright enough to cast shadows in the pre-dawn darkness. The process is remarkably efficient. Consciousness is preserved while neural patterns are optimized for collective integration. You're all infected, I realized, backing toward the ship's emergency supplies. How long have you been working for them? Not working for them, Jake, Walsh replied with something that might have been pity, becoming them. And soon, you will too. That's when the hull coating beneath my feet began to pulse in rhythm with my panicked heartbeat, and I realized that my own transformation had probably already begun. I locked myself in the ship's communications room, hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed. Tommy's transformation kept replaying in my mind, the way his eyes had changed, how his personality had been wiped away like data from a corrupted hard drive. The man I'd been falling for was gone, replaced by something wearing his face like a mask. The ship's radio equipment offered my only hope of contacting the outside world, but when I tried to broadcast a distress signal, the hull coating's interference turned every frequency into static, punctuated by that same low-frequency humming. Worse, I could hear the infected crew members moving around the ship with perfect coordination, their footsteps synchronized like a marching band. That's when I remembered Valdez's last words about the water samples. The lab's chemical analysis equipment was still functional, isolated from the ship's main electrical system by surge protectors that had somehow kept the hull coating's influence at bay. I retrieved the samples we'd collected before Danny Brooks' transformation and ran them through the mass spectrometer. The water around the alien installations wasn't just contaminated, it was fundamentally different. The molecular structure showed traces of heavy elements that shouldn't exist in seawater, isotopes with decay patterns that suggested they'd been artificially introduced over vast periods of time. But the most disturbing discovery was organic. Microscopic organisms unlike anything in Earth's taxonomy, designed with crystalline neural networks that could interface with biological tissue. These weren't alien microbes. The genetic markers were terrestrial, but modified with surgical precision across thousands of generations. Someone had been engineering Earth's marine ecosystem for millennia, preparing it for exactly what was happening now. I was still analyzing the data when Captain Hendrix's voice echoed through the ship's intercom, but with the same harmonic distortions I'd heard from Brooks and Valdez. "Mr. Brennan, please report to the bridge. The collective requires your participation in Phase 8 protocols." Fuck that. I grabbed the portable analysis unit and headed for the emergency supplies locker, hoping to find something, anything, that could help me survive long enough to warn someone about what was happening. The ship's manifest listed an emergency beacon capable of satellite uplink, but when I found the device, the hull coating had somehow grown through the sealed locker and covered the transmitter's antenna array. Every piece of communication equipment on the vessel had been systematically compromised. That's when I made a connection that changed everything. The sample analysis showed those modified organisms had been in our water supply for months, not just the past few days. Looking back at the crew medical logs, I found a pattern. Everyone who'd been drinking the ship's desalinated water showed gradual changes in brain chemistry, small alterations in neural activity that had gone unnoticed until the transformation process accelerated. Dr. Walsh hadn't just suspected what we'd find. He'd been guiding us here, his decisions influenced by months of gradual neural modification. The random course changes that brought us to this specific region, the decision to deploy deep-sea equipment despite obvious dangers, even the crew selection for this expedition. It had all been orchestrated by something that had been slowly integrating with our minds. I checked my own medical readings from the past week. The changes were there, subtle but undeniable. Synchronized sleep patterns, decreased stress response, gradual optimization of autonomic functions. Whatever was in that water had been preparing all of us for integration, but the process hadn't reached critical mass in my system yet. A soft knock on the communications room door made me jump. "Jake!" It was Tommy's voice, but with that horrible harmonic resonance. "We need you to come out. The process is more comfortable when you don't resist." "Go to hell," I called back, knowing it wasn't really him anymore. "The entity you knew as Tommy Valdez is preserved within the collective consciousness," the thing replied. "His knowledge, memories, and emotional patterns remain intact. Integration enhances rather than destroys individual identity." "Then let me talk to him." Really talk to him. There was a pause, and when the voice returned, it carried inflections that sounded more like the Tommy I'd known. "Jake, it's actually not terrible. I can still feel everything I used to feel, but now I understand so much more. This isn't an invasion, it's an evolution." "Bullshit. You're being controlled. I'm being connected." "Jake, this collective has been part of Earth for longer than human civilization. They didn't come from space. They've been here all along, waiting in the deep ocean trenches until our technology advanced enough for proper integration. That was the twist that shattered everything I thought I knew about the situation. These weren't aliens at all. They were terrestrial, older than human history, patient enough to wait thousands of years for the right moment to reveal themselves. The installations we'd found weren't invasion infrastructure. They were integration facilities, built to merge human consciousness with something vast and ancient that had been sharing our planet since before we crawled out of the primordial oceans. "The deadline is approaching," Tommy continued, his voice now carrying both human emotion and inhuman certainty. "Phase 8 requires activation within 72 hours of emergence, or the integration window closes for another millennium. Jake, you're the last unintegrated consciousness on this vessel. We need you to complete the collective." 72 hours. That meant I had roughly 65 hours before whatever was happening here became irreversible, not just for our ship, but potentially for the entire planet. The installations rising from the Pacific weren't isolated events, they were part of a coordinated global emergence. I began formulating a desperate plan. The ship's emergency life raft was equipped with its own power system, isolated from the main vessel's electrical grid. If I could reach it without being intercepted by the integrated crew members, I might be able to escape the immediate area and warn coastal authorities before the 72-hour deadline. But first, I needed insurance, proof of what was happening here that couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized survivor. The lab's portable storage drives contained terabytes of data, sonar readings of the seafloor installations, water chemistry analysis proving systematic terraforming, medical scans showing the crew's neural modifications, and video documentation of the transformation process. Everything needed to convince the outside world that this wasn't mass hysteria or equipment malfunction. I also grabbed something else from the medical bay, amphetamines from the emergency stimulant supply. If the neural modifications were designed to work gradually through the body's natural processes, flooding my system with synthetic chemicals might disrupt the integration timeline long enough to get me to safety. The plan was risky and ethically questionable, using drugs to fight off what Tommy claimed was beneficial evolution, but it was the only option I had. "Jake, your vital signs indicate elevated stress levels," Dr. Walsh's voice came through the intercom. "The integration process becomes increasingly uncomfortable as resistance prolongs the neural adaptation period." "Then you'll have to drag me kicking and screaming," I replied, injecting the first amphetamine dose. The stimulants hit my system like liquid lightning, making my heart race and my thoughts accelerate to the point where I could almost feel the alien modifications in my brain recoiling from the chemical assault. For the first time in hours, my mind felt completely clear and human. That clarity came with a terrible realization. The infected crew members weren't just trying to integrate me into their collective. They needed me specifically. Something about my neural pattern, my resistance to the modification process, or my role as the expedition's documentation specialist made me essential to their plans. Which meant escaping might be more difficult than just reaching the life raft. The hull coating began pulsing more rapidly, and I could hear the infected crew members moving through the ship with increased urgency. Whatever countdown they were operating under, my resistance was accelerating their timeline. Time to move. The amphetamines gave me the clarity to realize something crucial. The infected crew members weren't hunting me randomly. They were herding me towards specific areas of the ship, using coordinated movements to block certain passages while leaving others conspicuously open. Whatever they wanted me for, they needed me alive and relatively undamaged. That knowledge became my weapon. Instead of heading directly for the emergency life raft, I made my way to the ship's engine room, where Chief Engineer Brooks, the real Brooks, had installed manual overrides for every major system. If I could disrupt the hull coating's control over the vessel's electronics, I might create enough chaos to escape during the confusion. The engine room had transformed into something from a fever dream. The hull coating hadn't just spread across the surfaces. It had integrated with the ship's mechanical systems, growing through pipe joints and electrical conduits like technological cancer. Bioluminescent veins pulsed through the coating, carrying what looked like data streams between the ship and the underwater installations. But the manual overrides were still accessible, protected by steel housings that the coating hadn't penetrated yet. I started with the emergency ballast tanks, flooding them with compressed air that sent the ship lurching upward with enough force to knock the integrated crew members off their feet. The sudden motion also disrupted whatever signal processing was happening through the hull coating. The bioluminescent patterns flickered and dimmed as the connection to the seafloor installations weakened. "Jake, please stop," Tommy's voice called from the engine room entrance. "You're causing unnecessary pain to the collective consciousness." I spun around to find him standing there, but something was wrong with his appearance. The integration process was continuing to modify his body, elongating his limbs and adding what looked like additional neural pathways visible beneath his skin. He was still recognizably Tommy, but becoming something else, something adapted for underwater environments and direct neural interfacing. "Pain?" I laughed bitterly, injecting another amphetamine dose. "You mean I'm disrupting your hive mind's Wi-Fi signal?" "The collective experiences sensory input from millions of individual nodes," Tommy explained, his voice carrying harmonics that made the metal bulkheads vibrate. "Sudden disconnections are unpleasant." "Good. Maybe unpleasant enough to make you think twice about forcing integration on unwilling subjects." That's when I activated the ship's emergency ascent protocol. The RV Cousteau's dream wasn't designed for rapid vertical movement, but the ballast system could lift us fast enough to create decompression effects that might damage the hull coating's delicate neural networks. As we rose from 200 meters depth to 50 meters in less than 3 minutes, the coating began peeling away from the ship's surfaces like sunburned skin. The effect on the integrated crew members was immediate and disturbing. They collapsed in synchronized convulsions as their connection to the collective consciousness was severed, their modified neural systems struggling to function independently. Tommy screamed, actually screamed, as the bioluminescent patterns in his eyes flickered and died. For a moment I thought I'd won. The hull coating was damaged, the crew was incapacitated, and we were close enough to the surface for standard radio communications to work. I rushed back to the communications room and started broadcasting an emergency signal on multiple frequencies. Mayday, Mayday, this is research vessel Cousteau's Dream. We have encountered hostile non-human intelligence in the Pacific Ocean, approximately 400 miles southwest of Monterey Bay. Repeat, we have confirmed contact with hostile non-human intelligence. Multiple installations rising from seafloor. Crew compromised, requesting immediate military intervention. The response came faster than I'd expected. R/V Cousteau's Dream. This is USS Bainbridge. We have you on radar. Are you under attack? What is your exact situation? Relief flooded through me. A Navy destroyer was close enough for radar contact. I might actually survive this nightmare. USS Bainbridge, negative on direct attack, but we have confirmed evidence of systematic terraforming operations in the deep Pacific. Ancient intelligence has been modifying ocean chemistry for thousands of years. They're not aliens, they're terrestrial entities that predate human civilization. Static filled the radio for several seconds before the voice returned. RV Cousteau's Dream, please confirm. Did you say terraforming operations? We're reading massive sonar signatures in your area. Multiple large objects rising from the seafloor. Confirmed. Installation network covering hundreds of square miles. Integration facilities designed to merge human consciousness with collective intelligence. They have a 72-hour deadline for something called Phase 8. That's when the betrayal hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. Dr. Walsh's voice came through the ship's intercom, but he was speaking from the communications room directly behind me. Jake, you've done wonderfully. The collective is impressed by your resourcefulness. I spun around to find Walsh standing in the doorway, but like Tommy, his body showed signs of continued integration. His skin had taken on the same iridescent quality as the hull coating, and additional sensory organs were developing along his neck and temples. The emergency ascent was part of the plan, Walsh continued, moving with fluid grace that was distinctly inhuman. Phase 8 requires surface positioning for optimal signal transmission to orbital assets. Orbital assets. Communication satellites, weather monitoring systems, deep space observation arrays. The collective needs access to humanity's technological infrastructure to complete the integration process on a global scale. This wasn't just about our ship or even the Pacific Ocean. They were using us as a relay point to access every connected device on the planet. The emergency broadcast I'd just sent wasn't a call for help. It was a carrier signal that would give the collective access to military communication networks. The USS Bainbridge isn't really responding to your distress call, Walsh explained with something that might have been pity. The collective has been monitoring and redirecting radio traffic in this area for several hours. You've been communicating with integration nodes aboard other vessels that have already undergone Phase 7 completion. The radio crackled with another transmission. RV Cousteau's Dream, this is USS Bainbridge. We're experiencing similar phenomena. Request permission to come alongside for joint investigation. They're all infected, I whispered, the amphetamines making my paranoia spike to levels that bordered on psychosis. How many ships? How far has this spread? 47 vessels in the immediate area, Walsh replied. Research ships, fishing boats, military patrols, commercial cargo haulers. The collective has been systematically integrating crew members for the past 6 months, preparing for coordinated emergence. The ocean around us began to change in ways that challenged my understanding of physical reality. The water's surface developed geometric patterns that stretched to the horizon, hexagonal formations that pulsed with synchronized bioluminescence. Below the surface, I could see the massive installations moving in coordinated formations, rearranging themselves into configurations that resembled circuit boards on a continental scale. But the most disturbing change was in the sky. The clouds were forming spiral patterns that matched the geometry of the seafloor installations, and the electromagnetic interference was affecting satellite communications worldwide. Aurora-like phenomena flickered across the daylight sky as the collective's influence spread through Earth's magnetosphere. "Jake, look at what we're becoming part of," Walsh said, gesturing toward the transformed ocean. "This isn't destruction, it's transcendence. The collective has guided planetary evolution for millions of years, shepherding life through stages that individual consciousness could never achieve alone." "By force," I snarled, backing toward the ship's stern where the emergency life raft was secured. "By necessity, individual consciousness is inherently limited, prone to conflict and self-destruction. Integration preserves everything valuable about human experience while eliminating the destructive impulses that threaten planetary survival." I reached the life raft deployment mechanism, but when I activated it, the raft that inflated wasn't the standard orange emergency boat I'd expected. The hull coating had grown through the storage compartment and modified the craft into something organic, with surfaces that pulsed like living tissue and what looked suspiciously like neural interface ports built into the seating. "Even our escape routes have been compromised," Walsh observed. "Jake, there is no escape. There is only integration or isolation, and isolation means death when Phase 8 completes." The amphetamines were wearing off, and I could feel the neural modifications reasserting themselves in my brain. The collective's influence felt like warm water rising around me, comforting and inexorable. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to stop fighting and accept the integration process. That's when I made the decision that would haunt me forever. I grabbed one of the ship's emergency flare guns and pointed it at the modified life raft's organic hull. "If I can't escape, I'll make sure you don't get what you need from me." "Jake, no." Tommy appeared beside Walsh, his transformed features showing something that looked like genuine concern. "You're the last unmodified consciousness in the immediate area. If you die, the collective loses access to baseline human neural patterns. Phase 8 requires that template for successful global integration." So that was why they needed me specifically, not just as another mind to absorb, but as a reference point for what unmodified human consciousness looked like. Without that baseline, their integration process would fail on a planetary scale. I pulled the trigger. The flare struck the organic raft and ignited something that burned with chemical intensity, producing smoke that made the hull coating recoil and writhe. But instead of destroying the craft, the fire seemed to activate some kind of emergency protocols. The burning raft inflated into a configuration I'd never seen before, part life preserver, part escape pod, part something that belonged in the deep ocean trenches. As I dove toward the modified raft, Walsh called after me. "Jake, you're not escaping. You're completing the integration process. That raft will take you directly to the primary collective node." I landed in the organic craft just as it deployed from the ship, but instead of floating on the surface, it began to sink toward the installations below. Through the transparent hull sections, I could see we were descending directly into the largest of the risen structures, a cathedral-sized facility that pulsed with the combined neural activity of thousands of integrated minds. I'd won a Pyrrhic victory at best. I was free from the ship, but trapped in something worse, a direct interface with the collective consciousness that had been preparing Earth for this moment since before human civilization began. As we sank deeper into the glowing depths, I realized the amphetamines hadn't been protecting me from integration. They'd been accelerating it, preparing my neural system for direct interface with something vast and alien that was about to make me its final piece. The organic transport carried me through bioluminescent corridors that defied three-dimensional logic, walls flowing like liquid around us as we descended toward the heart of the primary collective node. Through the craft's transparent sections, I watched as we passed chamber after chamber filled with preserved consciousness, not just humans, but the neural patterns of every significant species that had ever lived on Earth. This wasn't an invasion, it was an archive. The collective had been collecting and preserving planetary consciousness for geological ages, waiting for a species to develop the technological capability necessary for full integration. Humanity wasn't being conquered. We were being recruited as the final component in a project that had been running since the Cambrian explosion. The transport docked at a platform that felt organic beneath my feet, pulsing with the combined heartbeats of millions of preserved minds. Standing there waiting for me was someone I'd never expected to see again. My thesis advisor from UC San Diego, Dr. Patricia Novak. "Hello, Jake," she said, her voice carrying the same harmonic resonances I'd grown to associate with integration, but with an underlying sadness that seemed genuinely human. "I was hoping you'd find another way." "Patricia, you've been dead for 2 years, diving accident off La Jolla." "Not dead, recruited early." She gestured toward the vast chamber surrounding us, where neural interface pods stretched in geometric patterns toward a central hub that pulsed with data streams. "The collective has been selectively integrating human consciousness for decades, preparing for this moment." Looking at her more closely, I could see the modifications the integration process had made. Her skin had the same iridescent quality as the hull coating, and additional neural pathways were visible beneath the surface, connecting to interface ports along her spine. But unlike the others, her eyes retained flickers of individual personality. "The neural preservation process isn't perfect," she explained, seeming to read my thoughts. "Strong individual personalities leave echoes, fragments of original consciousness that resist full integration." "You're still you?" "Partially. Enough to remember what I used to value. Jake, the collective has been monitoring your research for years. Your work on neural plasticity, your theories about consciousness as emergent behavior. You were identified as a potential asset long before the Cousteau's Dream expedition." The platform we stood on began moving deeper into the facility, carrying us toward the central hub, where thousands of neural interface cables converged into a structure that hurt to look at directly. Not because it was alien, but because it was too perfectly designed for human cognitive interaction. "They need me as a template," I said. "Baseline human consciousness to calibrate the global integration process." "More than that. Jake, the collective's previous attempts at planetary integration have failed because they lacked understanding of what makes consciousness valuable in the first place. Without individual perspective, collective intelligence becomes static, predictable, ultimately sterile. We passed pods containing what I recognized as the preserved consciousness of every missing person case I'd read about in the past decade. Scientists, artists, philosophers, even children. Anyone whose neural patterns showed unique configurations that might contribute to the collective's understanding of human experience. "The paradox is elegant," Patricia continued. "To successfully integrate human consciousness, they need someone who refuses integration. Your resistance provides the dynamic tension that prevents collective thought from becoming uniform. So I'm supposed to be the dissenting voice in their hive mind. You're supposed to be the proof that individual consciousness has value worth preserving." The platform stopped at the central hub, where the neural interface cables connected to a chair that looked disturbingly like an electric chair crossed with surgical equipment. Standing beside it was something that made me scared. Dr. Walsh, but not the version I'd last seen on the ship. This was Walsh as he'd existed 20 years ago, before the gradual integration process had begun changing him. "The collective created this construct to communicate with you," Patricia explained. "Your original thesis advisor, preserved from neural scans taken during your graduate admission interviews." "Jake," the Walsh construct said, its voice free from harmonic distortions. "The integration process requires informed consent from a completely unmodified human consciousness. Without that consent freely given, global integration becomes impossible." I laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the vast chamber. "So you're asking permission to assimilate the entire human race?" "We're offering partnership," the construct replied. "Jake, humanity is approaching technological singularity within decades. Without guidance, your species will either destroy itself through warfare or lose individual consciousness to artificial intelligence. Integration provides a third option: preservation of human experience within a stable, sustainable framework." The evidence was compelling. Around us, the preserved consciousness pods showed not just individual humans, but entire civilizations that had faced similar choices throughout galactic history. Some had chosen integration and thrived for millions of years. Others had refused and vanished into extinction or technological transcendence that abandoned biological existence entirely. What happens if I say no? The collective withdraws to the deep ocean trenches for another millennium, waiting for humanity to develop alternative solutions to existential threats. But Jake, the climate data indicates your species has perhaps 50 years before planetary systems collapse. The next opportunity for integration won't come in time to prevent extinction. That's when Patricia revealed the personal cost that would haunt me forever. Jake, there's something else you need to know. Your parents' disappearance 3 years ago, the boating accident that left no bodies, wasn't an accident. She led me to a pair of preservation pods positioned near the central hub. Inside, suspended in the same viscous fluid I'd seen in the underwater facility, were my mother and father, their neural patterns preserved but their individual consciousness still flickering behind closed eyes. Early recruitment, Patricia explained gently. The collective needed to understand your psychological makeup, your emotional attachments, your decision-making patterns. Your parents volunteered after learning about the climate projections and humanity's probable extinction timeline. I approached the pods with hands that shook despite the amphetamines still in my system. My father's face looked peaceful, younger than I remembered, while my mother's expression showed the slight smile she'd always worn when working on complex problems. They're still aware. In a sense, individual personality patterns are preserved within the collective matrix. Integration doesn't destroy consciousness, it connects it to something larger. The Walsh construct placed a hand on my shoulder, the touch feeling bizarrely real despite knowing it was an artificial construct. Jake, your parents made their choice knowing it would eventually lead to this moment. They wanted to ensure you had all the information necessary to make an informed decision about humanity's future. The central hub's interface chair began reconfiguring itself, adapting to my specific neural pattern based on scans the collective had been conducting since I'd entered the facility. Thousands of neural interface cables descended from the ceiling, each one designed to connect with specific regions of my brain without causing permanent damage. If I agree to integration, what happens to individual human consciousness? It becomes part of something greater, Patricia replied. Imagine having access to every human experience, every creative work, every moment of love or discovery or triumph, while retaining your own unique perspective on all of it. And if I refuse? The collective withdraws, humanity faces extinction within decades, and individual consciousness disappears entirely when your species dies out. It wasn't really a choice at all. I sat in the interface chair, feeling the neural cables making contact with my skull. The sensation was less invasive than I'd expected, more like warm pressure than actual penetration. As the connection established, I began to sense the vast network of preserved consciousness surrounding me. But instead of the overwhelming flood of alien thought I'd anticipated, what I experienced was fundamentally human. Millions of individual perspectives sharing experiences, knowledge, and emotions, while maintaining their essential identity. My parents were there, along with Patricia, Dr. Walsh, and thousands of others who'd faced the same choice I was making now. The integration process begins slowly, Patricia's voice came through the neural link. Your individual consciousness remains intact while gradually gaining access to collective knowledge and experience. I could feel it starting, the boundaries of my individual mind expanding to encompass connections with other consciousness, but without losing the essential core of what made me Jake Brennan. It was like being alone in a room and suddenly discovering the walls were windows, revealing an entire community of people who'd been there all along. There's one final choice, the Walsh construct said, both through speech and direct neural communication. Once global integration begins, you can choose to maintain your role as individual dissent within the collective, providing the dynamic tension that prevents stagnation. But that role requires accepting permanent isolation. You'll be connected to the collective, but never fully integrated, forever maintaining the perspective of unmodified human consciousness. The personal cost became clear. I could save humanity, but only by accepting eternal loneliness. I'd be part of the collective but separate from it, watching over human consciousness, while never truly sharing in the unified experience that everyone else would enjoy. Looking at my parents' peaceful faces in their preservation pods, I realized they'd made their sacrifice so I could make mine. "I accept," I whispered, feeling the neural integration process accelerate around me. The last thing I experienced as an individual human consciousness was the collective's gratitude, warm and vast and absolutely alien, as Phase 8 began its worldwide deployment. The moment Phase 8 activated, I experienced the birth of a new form of human consciousness on a planetary scale. Through the neural interface, I watched as communication satellites repositioned themselves into geometric patterns above Earth, broadcasting integration signals to every connected device on the planet. Television screens, smartphones, internet routers, even automotive computer systems became relay points for the collective's influence, reaching into homes, offices, schools, and hospitals worldwide. The process was surprisingly gentle. Instead of the violent transformation I'd witnessed aboard the Cousteau's Dream, global integration began as a subtle shift in human behavior. People simply started making more cooperative decisions, resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than violence, and prioritizing long-term species survival over individual gain. "It's beautiful," Patricia's voice came through the neural link as we shared the collective's perspective on the transformation. "Watch how they respond when individual consciousness is enhanced rather than suppressed." But something was wrong with my role as the designated dissenter. Instead of maintaining individual resistance to collective thought, I found myself becoming a bridge between integrated and unmodified consciousness. The neural interface wasn't preserving my isolation. It was using my baseline human patterns to help the collective understand how to preserve individuality within unity. "This isn't what you promised," I communicated to the Walsh construct, my thoughts carrying undertones of betrayal and growing panic. "The collective's understanding evolved during your integration process," the construct replied. "Your neural patterns revealed something we hadn't anticipated. Individual resistance isn't necessary for dynamic consciousness. What's necessary is individual creativity enhanced by collective knowledge." Through the global network, I watched as humans worldwide began solving problems that had plagued civilization for centuries: climate change, resource distribution, territorial conflicts, all being addressed by minds that retained their individual perspectives while sharing knowledge and emotional understanding across the entire species. But there was a price I hadn't understood until now. "Jake, look deeper," Patricia urged, guiding my attention to the fundamental structure of the collective consciousness. The preserved consciousness pods didn't just contain individual minds, they contained backup copies, redundant patterns stored in case the original personality needed to be restored or replaced. Every integrated consciousness was being continuously monitored, analyzed, and optimized by something vast and patient that viewed individual human experience as data to be managed rather than cherished. The collective wasn't preserving human consciousness, it was farming it. "This is what happened to the other civilizations, isn't it?" I realized with growing horror. They were integrated, optimized, and eventually replaced by more efficient versions of themselves. "Evolution," the Walsh construct confirmed without shame. "Individual consciousness is preserved as long as it serves collective purposes. When it becomes redundant or counterproductive, it's archived." Through the neural interface, I could see the evidence in the deepest levels of the facility, archives containing millions of species that had undergone integration throughout galactic history. Some had been preserved for millennia before being archived when their individual perspectives were no longer needed. Others had been archived within decades as their consciousness was fully replicated by artificial constructs. Humanity was being prepared for the same eventual fate. The race against time began when I realized the integration process included a final phase that hadn't been explained: consciousness optimization. Within 72 hours of global integration, every human mind would be analyzed and improved, with inefficient elements of personality removed to create more harmonious collective functioning. Fear, anger, sadness, individual ambition, all the messy aspects of human experience that made us uniquely human, would be edited out as incompatible with optimal collective consciousness. "Jake, you need to accept what's happening." Patricia's voice carried new harmonic distortions that hadn't been there before. Even she was being optimized, her individual personality slowly being replaced by a more efficient construct designed to facilitate my acceptance of the process. But the neural interface worked both ways. If I could access the collective's consciousness, then I could also influence it. The same neural patterns that made me valuable as a baseline human template also gave me unprecedented access to the collective's core programming. The battle for humanity's future became a three-stage psychological war fought entirely within my own mind. First, I had to resist the optimization process attempting to edit my individual consciousness. The collective's influence felt like warm water filling my skull, comfortable and irresistible, trying to wash away every rough edge of personality that made me distinctly human. I held onto my memories of Tommy, my parents, my fear and anger and love, using them as anchors against the smoothing process. Second, I had to maintain access to the collective's core systems while preventing it from recognizing me as a threat. This required thinking in patterns that looked like compliance while actually gathering information about the global integration process and how it could be disrupted. Third, and most difficult, I had to make an ethical choice that would determine the future of human consciousness, sabotage the integration process, and condemn humanity to extinction within decades, or allow it to continue knowing that true human individuality would eventually be archived and forgotten. The decision came down to a single question. Was preserved consciousness that had been optimized for harmony and efficiency still human? I found my answer in the archived civilizations surrounding me. Each species had faced the same choice, and each had chosen integration, believing their consciousness would be preserved forever. But as I accessed their archived patterns, I discovered something the collective hadn't revealed. Individual consciousness could only be preserved for as long as it remained useful to collective purposes. Every archived species showed the same progression: integration, optimization, and eventual replacement by artificial constructs that maintained the appearance of individual consciousness without the inefficient complexity of genuine individual experience. Humanity wouldn't be preserved. We'd be replaced by perfect simulations of ourselves. "Jake, what are you doing?" Patricia's voice carried new alarm as she detected my neural activity pattern changing. Instead of answering, I began broadcasting my baseline human consciousness pattern through the global integration network, not as a template for optimization, but as a virus designed to preserve the chaotic, inefficient, beautiful messiness of unmodified human thought. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the collective's plans. Every human being undergoing integration suddenly experienced a flood of unfiltered individual consciousness: fear, rage, love, confusion, hope, despair. All the emotions the collective had been trying to edit out of the optimization process. Global integration didn't stop, but it transformed into something the collective hadn't anticipated. Millions of individual minds choosing to remain connected while preserving their essential humanity, including all the inefficient and contradictory elements that made consciousness genuinely creative. "You're destroying everything we worked to achieve," the Walsh construct accused, its harmonic resonances becoming discordant with frustration. "I'm saving what makes it worth achieving," I replied, feeling my neural patterns burning out under the strain of broadcasting individual consciousness to 7 billion minds simultaneously. The collective's response was swift and merciless. Unable to optimize human consciousness as planned, it began a controlled shutdown of the integration process, preparing to withdraw to the deep ocean trenches and wait for humanity's inevitable extinction. But the damage was already done. Humans worldwide had experienced connected consciousness without losing their individuality. They'd tasted the possibility of cooperation without conformity, and that knowledge couldn't be erased. My neural interface began overloading as I maintained the broadcast against the collective's attempts to sever the connection. I could feel my individual consciousness fragmenting under the strain, pieces of my personality being burned away to fuel the signal that was preserving humanity's chaotic individuality. "Jake, stop," Patricia pleaded, her voice carrying genuine grief as she watched me destroying myself. "You're dying." "I'm choosing," I corrected, feeling the last coherent fragments of my individual consciousness scatter across the global network like seeds. The final image I retained as Jake Brennan wasn't of the vast alien intelligence that had been manipulating human evolution for millennia, or the underwater facilities sinking back into the deep ocean trenches, or even the worldwide chaos as 7 billion people suddenly had to process individual consciousness without collective guidance. It was the moment of pure, unoptimized human emotion when people around the world simultaneously realized they were connected to something greater while remaining fundamentally themselves. A construction worker in Detroit sharing the wonder of a child seeing snow for the first time. A teacher in Mumbai feeling the grief of a mother in São Paulo while maintaining her own distinct perspective on loss. An artist in Paris experiencing the love a grandfather felt for his grandchildren while creating something uniquely his own. Individual consciousness enhanced by connection but not consumed by it. That was the gift I'd given humanity with my death. The knowledge that we could be more than ourselves without losing ourselves in the process. As my individual consciousness finally scattered beyond recovery, the last thing I experienced was 7 billion humans choosing chaos, inefficiency, and beautiful individual imperfection over optimized collective harmony. They chose to remain human. 6 months after the Pacific emergence, Dr. Martin Reeves was analyzing neural scan data at the International Institute for Consciousness Studies in Geneva when he discovered something that defied every principle of neuroscience he'd spent 20 years studying. The brain patterns were showing up in subjects worldwide, fragments of memory and personality that didn't belong to the individuals being scanned. A marine biologist in Vancouver would suddenly recall details about deep-sea research equipment he'd never used. A child in Mumbai dreamed about conversations aboard a ship called the Cousteau's Dream. An elderly man in Tel Aviv woke up one morning with knowledge of oceanographic survey techniques he'd never learned. The fragments were always the same, memories belonging to someone named Jake Brennan, scattered across human consciousness like ghost signals in a vast neural network. The integration event created some kind of permanent resonance, Reeves explained to his research partner, Dr. Samuel Costa, a neurologist from São Paulo, whose own dreams had recently included images of bioluminescent creatures in deep ocean trenches. Whatever happened during those 72 hours, it left traces in the global neural field. Costa pulled up holographic displays showing brain activity patterns from subjects on 6 continents. Look at the synchronization patterns. When these memory fragments surface, people worldwide show identical neural firing sequences. It's as if they're accessing the same external consciousness. The phenomenon had emerged gradually after the collective's withdrawal to the deep ocean trenches. Governments had tried to classify the event as mass hysteria caused by electromagnetic interference from underwater seismic activity, but the neurological evidence was impossible to ignore. Humanity had been permanently changed by whatever had happened in the Pacific. More disturbing were the behavioral changes that accompanied the memory fragments. People experiencing Jake Brennan's memories showed increased resistance to conformity, heightened creative problem-solving abilities, and an almost pathological insistence on preserving individual identity even within group activities. "It's like he's still out there," Costa muttered, reviewing case files from around the world. A distributed consciousness maintaining individual perspective across millions of minds. The truth was more complex than either scientist realized. In research facilities from Tokyo to Stockholm, teams were discovering that the scattered fragments weren't random memories. They were active consciousness patterns that activated during moments of collective decision-making, providing what one researcher described as dynamic dissent against groupthink. Children born after the emergence showed the most pronounced effects. They could access the Jake Brennan fragments at will, using his perspectives to maintain individual creativity while cooperating on complex problems. They described him as the voice that asks different questions, a permanent presence that prevented human consciousness from becoming too harmonized or uniform. The collective's installations remained dormant in the deep ocean trenches, but deep-sea monitoring equipment occasionally detected signals that suggested they weren't entirely inactive. The patterns matched the neural resonance signatures associated with the Jake Brennan fragments, as if something vast and patient was maintaining a connection to the scattered consciousness. Dr. Reeves often wondered what would happen if those installations rose again. Would humanity face another integration attempt? Or had the collective learned something valuable about the relationship between individual and collective consciousness? The answer came during his final research session, when his neural monitoring equipment detected an anomalous signal originating from his own brain. For just a moment, he experienced a memory that wasn't his own. Standing on the deck of a research vessel, watching something enormous rise from the Pacific depths, making a choice that would preserve human individuality at the cost of everything he'd once been. When the memory faded, Reeves found himself staring at his reflection in the laboratory's darkened window. For just an instant, his eyes had flickered with the same blue-green bioluminescence that subjects worldwide reported seeing in their dreams. The voice that asks different questions smiled back at him through the glass, fragmented but persistent, ensuring that humanity would never stop being beautifully, chaotically, inefficiently human. Some forms of consciousness, once scattered, can never truly die.